A couple summers ago, I found this Super Game Boy at a local game shop for a decent price. I never really owned one, and I thought, well, this will be fun. I do have some Game Boy games. I can bring those Game Boy games into Game Club using this so kids can play on the big screen instead of trying to use a small Game Boy Pocket with a black and white screen and no backlight. Well, like most things I buy at a good price that just sit on the shelves for years, I completely forgot about it. In fact, it was in one of these bins down here for a very long time. Until recently, I was looking for a Final Fantasy game for another TikTok video I was making, and I stumbled upon it again. I thought to myself, wouldn't that be neat? In Game Club in the past, I've really restrained myself from bringing in some of my more rare, or interesting, or easily losable pieces of equipment down here, despite the fact that I'm willing to risk $200 controllers, $300 controllers, specialty controllers, and all this other good stuff in Game Club. Fishing poles, no problem, all that good stuff. But for some reason, the Super Game Boy was just too much of a risk for me. Anyways, I've stopped doing that. I've brought a lot more of my games down here that we just don't play as much into Game Club. But enough of the rambling already. Why am I talking about the Super Game Boy? Well, I found some cool stuff out last week when I brought it in. See, I brought it in just to play Super Mario Land and Wario World, but I also brought in some other carts that I figured I could play before school started or between periods because I'm a responsible teacher. Now, to show you all this stuff, I'm going to have to move the SNES out of this little cubby hole here and put it somewhere so we can see it and interact with it on this TV. So give me one moment. I just have to come over here. I got to take all this garbage out of here, move it, put it somewhere I guess I don't really want this or need it. Let's set up. Oh boy. Okay, well the cords are long enough, they reached. Charge? Hey, cool. So first things first, let's turn on our Sony Vega over here, as I've been corrected a million times. That's a W. We're in America. That's a Wega to me. We have our TV turned down over here. We're all set. Hopefully you can see it there, this gigantic 32-inch TV down here. And the first thing I want to show you is what happens when you put it in. All right, so nothing. Well, there's something. It's just a black screen. So no game, black screen. Great, awesome. You're welcome out there, YouTube. Let's look at some platform games. This here, Wario Land, is Super Mario Land 3, I believe, and let's see what it looks like. Turn it on, put it in. Okay, turn it on, see what happens. And when there's no game inside, there's no game inside. It shows that there's a cartridge missing, and then a little Nintendo logo down there doesn't post. But you do get this cool Game Boy outline that's pretty neat. I'm assuming that's there to keep the scaling of the game itself intact so it doesn't blow up too much and become really, really pixelated and unplayable. Let's turn this off, and we'll put Wario Land in there, and we'll power it on. Okay. Cool. I was so hopeful for a second. I guess we have to do the fabled double blow. So let's pop it out. Aha, there we go. Good. So we got Wario Land. Pretty cool. It looks good. It sounds better, I guess, for what the sound is meant to be on those speakers. But yeah, in general, this is what it looks like. Play with a full-size controller. Obviously, only need a couple of buttons here. This is an 8-bit do controller for the SNES. I do enjoy these. Just go ahead and figure out what button we're supposed to be. All right, let's go down. Never played this game before. This is my first time playing a Wario Land game. So I have no idea what I'm supposed to be doing. Oh, okay, I guess this is the first level. Never played Wario Land before. Seems like a fun platform. I know it's popular. I know Wario's popular in general. It actually responds pretty well. And the fact that I'm using a Super Game Boy along with a wireless controller, modern controller, no lag, no delays. It looks pretty good. It sounds great. But man, those colors, those two-tone colors, kind of rough in the eyes. Although I'm glad I'm looking at it on this screen and not a screen that has no backlight and needs desperately some color. So that's a fun thing. If you take a normal Game Boy game, pop it in the Super Game Boy, it plays just fine. It's pretty cool. But there's other stuff that happened too with the Super Game Boy, and I kind of remember this a little bit, but not much, until recently when I booted this up at school. Now, recently, that means about a month ago when I made the video. I haven't posted yet. But if you take a game that's much later for the Game Boy, like, I don't know, let's say Pokemon Red here, and you put in the Super Game Boy, you might notice some enhancements. Now, I don't own enough Game Boy games to tell you this for sure, but I almost remember there being somewhere in the box saying enhanced for Super Game Boy, and that's because it was. Check this out. We boot up, we get our normal Super Game Boy screen here, but as soon as we get into Pokemon Red, hopefully it loads, something different happens. Notice how that side faded away, and now we have full color Pokemon on the sides over here. Okay, we'll press some buttons on the gamepad here, and try to bring up the menu. I don't know how you do it exactly, so we're just playing the guessing game right now. No, maybe it starts select at the same time? How did I do it before? If we press up button somewhere on the gamepad, we'll bring up a menu here for the Super Game Boy. This is a pretty cool thing, that you can change the color palette of what you're seeing on the screen here. Sure, they're not the greatest options in the world, and some of them look downright terrible, but in general, it's pretty cool that you can do this in the first place. I believe this is what they call a Super Game Boy enhanced game. I think you can even make your own color palettes too, but I don't have time to get into that. Now, if there's any sound happening right now, it's muted because I don't want Nintendo being angry at me and trying to copyright claim this channel. By the way, the menu comes up with the L and R buttons together, so we can see what we have here. We have this option, which is, I'm guessing, a border. Oh, okay, so you can change borders. Don't want the Pokemon border? You can change borders. Did not even know this. Kind of cool. I guess you can have it however you want. It's kind of funky. And you can even make your own over here, it seems. This little drawing pixel over here, I'm guessing. Interesting. Okay, we'll go back and see what other options we get. We get controller options, it looks like. Yep, we got Type A and Type B, so you can change how you want to control things. Over here we have, I guess, yeah, DIY stuff. It seems you can do some DIY stuff here. What exactly, I'm not sure. Probably change this background, even take a picture. Interesting. Weird stuff here. I have no idea what I'm looking at, but cool nonetheless. Also, I mean, kind of pointless nowadays. A lot of these things can be played in a web browser window, but definitely something fun about having the old hardware. And this looks like some kind of erase feature where you take out what you've done. Okay, so there you go. A lot of coloring, a lot of drawing modes in this. It's pretty cool. Nothing I would go excited for, but that's pretty neat. So there you go. That's an example of a Super Game Boy enhanced game for the Game Boy itself. Those were much later in the life cycle of the Game Boy, and the Game Boy life cycle, I believe, was a long time. That thing lasted forever, and it still kind of lives on the Nintendo Switch today. So that was Pokemon Red. I believe it's the only one I have. Now, here's one thing I want to get into before we move on to the very last thing here, and that is games that came out for the Game Boy Color. Now, this is something I didn't really remember very well, but it turns out that the Game Boy Color and the Game Boy itself had pretty different hardware inside that allowed for that color to happen. It's also why games could be much more enhanced. But the problem was, check this out. If I take a Game Boy Color game like Super Mario Bros. Deluxe here, my original copy by the way, and we pop it in there, we will most likely get an error message. We'll get a different kind of error message. It says basically, yeah, it's a Game Boy game, but not the right type. Mainly because the Game Boy Color was so much different than the original Game Boy. Unfortunately, as nice as it would be to play Game Boy Color games on the Super Game Boy, it just didn't happen. Now, if it worked with the Game Boy Player for the GameCube, I don't know. I don't have a Game Boy Player, and I really don't have $500 extra to spend on a gimmick right now. So, unfortunately, Game Boy Color games work on Game Boy Color only, and I believe Game Boy Advance models. Now, the reason this whole video started in the first place was because when I brought it in, I brought a gimmicky piece of equipment in with the Super Game Boy, and I didn't realize that it had been enhanced for the Super Game Boy. What am I talking about exactly? Well, that would be this. The Game Boy camera. One of the worst quality cameras ever made, but so cool, such weird features, and such a strange part of Nintendo history. If you say anything about Nintendo itself, they were always willing to take chances and risks with hardware, as strange as it may be, and this is kind of fun. I also think that Game Freak made this, or at least the software inside of it, and I believe they're responsible for some Pokemon games too. What I was surprised about is when I put this into the Super Game Boy, how many features were available, because it indeed had been enhanced for Super Game Boy. Check this out. Creatures in Game Freak. There you go. Notice the Game Boy camera has its own custom background. That's pretty cool. It's a lot easier to control too, although its usability, obviously as a camera, is going to be limited to wherever your SNES is. Let's see what happens when I turn it on, alright? And all these weird menus, I can't put the sound on, I'd love to, but these bizarre menus with their weird little gimmicks and characters, and I don't know, someone was on something at Nintendo that day. Okay, so this is a very well lit room right now, and I think you can kind of make me out over here. I got my controller all holed up right there. Let's mess with the contrast a little bit with that. Oh god. I guess that's better. Is that better or worse? Well, that's way worse.
No, don't do that.
All right, so if I crank the contrast up a little bit, and then what about brightness down? No, brightness up.
That's too much. Too much.
Too much?
Go back.
You have to give it a second. I feel like we're getting somewhere.
It actually shows up better on the screen.
I've noticed that a lot, where you take a picture or a video of something on the screen, and it looks a lot cleaner.
Yes, it does.
And I don't know why it does that. If someone in the comments can explain why what we're seeing looks pretty terrible, but what we see through the camera, the iPhone camera, looks great, it's beyond me. And there we go. This looks pretty cool. Let's take a picture. Yeah, of course we got to save that. All right, let's go back and see what else we got. Now, I'm not sure how much of this is actually enhanced for a Game Boy camera, if anything else at all. We have the same menu options from before. But I thought it was pretty cool that they thought long and hard enough to put some kind of function and feature for the Game Boy camera here right now. Now, you probably can't see this, or maybe you can because the camera comes through, but I brought this into Game Club last year, and these are probably a bunch of those photos of my students and me at school. They did have a blast with this thing, and we actually printed out some of those pictures. It was pretty cool. It's a weird little piece of history, that's for sure. So, the cool thing about this, aside from the fact that you have a camera on your SNES at this point, is that these games that you can play with the faces and the pictures you take are a lot more fun to play on a big screen than they are otherwise. Every time I find something cool out there that I forgot about, I figured I'd share with you guys out there. The Game Boy camera, the Super Game Boy, and the enhancements for Game Boy games through the SNES and through that magical device are pretty cool, and I think they're kind of forgotten at this point. I don't really see this thing get a lot of love out there on any kind of social media. I think it's because the Game Boy player for the Nintendo GameCube, it was so much more expensive and rare and hard to find and requires so much more that gets most of the attention. Regardless, the Super Game Boy is a pretty cool piece of history. This is going to go back into Game Club along with the camera. I have a Game Boy printer and some paper. I think the kids will have fun with that, at least seeing what the old technology was like. Because back then, having this camera in your pocket was actually pretty cool. Digital cameras weren't ubiquitous yet. I hope you enjoyed going on this journey with me, back through and looking at the Super Game Boy and all the cool stuff it did. From the Game Boy camera enhancements to the Pokemon enhancements, and just good old-fashioned playing Game Boy games on a real screen with real sound using an actual controller. A pretty cool piece of history, not completely forgotten, but certainly doesn't get the love it deserves.